right, so welcome to Willits Branch Library. This is our third installment of Who's Who in American History. And I think most of you were here last week, but the week before that we did our Founding Fathers and had a lively discussion on that. And last week we did women's rights activists. Today, you can tell by my image, we're going to talk about photographers. And we're going to talk about two people in particular that used their cameras as their tool to change not just change history, but change society as they saw it. And so I hope if you're not familiar with these people, you are more familiar by the end of the presentation. So the two people we're going to look at are Jacob Reese, and I see some head nods, familiar, and Dorothea Lang. Which one were you shaking your head at? Dorothea Lang. All right, so at least I'll get you some new information with Jacob Reese, maybe. So just a little bit of background. Jacob Reese lived from 1849 to 1914. He was 3 of 15 children, only 3 of which survived to adulthood, by 1900. He was a Danish immigrant to America in 1850. He was adult. He was 21 when he immigrated here. And just to give you a little idea of what society was like here when he immigrated, there was, for example, in 1880, 334,000 people into a single square mile of the Lower East Side of New York. So the population density was extremely packed, and it was the most densely populated place on the earth at the time. They were packed into filthy, disease-ridden tenements. There was no ordinances that said how these owners could rent, what condition the homes had to be in, and so they were in very poor condition. There was sometimes, the apartments were often 3 rooms, a front room, a middle room that served as a dining kitchen area, and then a back room. And many times families had to each share one of those rooms. You had a separate family in each. And so think of the size of families at this time. So there would be sometimes as many as 15 people to a room, and that's the only way families could afford to get their families indoors, is to rent out just one of these rooms in these apartments. The apartments were crammed so close together in the neighborhood that there was no windows down the side, so that middle room had literally no windows at all. And so it would be dark, obviously no electricity to these homes, even though some rural areas were gaining it. That was the middle class and upper class homes. No ventilation. By opening a window, you can get at least a cross breeze when things are bad. No running water. They might have like a bathroom per floor or one downstairs for everybody to use. So they used chamber pots. And of course, if you lived on the 3rd, 4th, or 5th story of a tenement apartment and you needed to offload your chamber pot, where would you do it? Of course, right out the window. And you're not going to slosh down the stairs with a full chamber pot. And so the streets were filthy. And it was just very uncomfortable living conditions inside and out. The apartments were so bad, most people spent their days outside, but outside wasn't much better anyways. So one of the things that Jacob Reese did is he had held many jobs, sometimes no job at all. He worked as an editor for a weekly newspaper, which he ended up buying, and did quite well, sold it for twice as much as he had bought it. But when he got the job as a police reporter is when he started his work that I'm going to share with you today. He worked in the most crime-ridden, impoverished slums of the city. And he wanted to visually document what he saw, and so he was one of the first people to use first American to use flash photography, because remember I said these rooms were dark, and if you want to get a picture inside, there was no way to do it. And so with flash photography, he could go in, ask if he could take their picture, and they're like, how? And then this bright light would come on and he could get a snapshot of these cities. He thought, nobody knows that doesn't live here how these people are living. And so he wanted to expose to the rest of the world, to the middle and upper class, those people that owned those factories, that they were hiring these people for such low wages that this is all they could afford. He wanted to expose that, and so he used his camera to shed light, no pun intended, to shed light on the truth of how we were treating these immigrants and these working class Americans. And so he was known as a social reformer, using his camera. He also went on a speaking tour, sharing his photographs that I will be sharing with you in a moment. And he published it in a book called How the Other Half Lives. And that's kind of a misnomer because it was probably more than half lived this way. So he publicized the crisis in housing, education, and poverty. He believed it was important and that it was even crucial to try to bring up the consciousness of to the public, to appeal to their generosity, to their conscience of what was going on. And so he did an investigation on these unsafe tenements. They were fire hazards. They were, like I said, disease-ridden. And it did have an effect. It resulted in the Small Park Act of 1887, where they built some places that were outside, that were clean, for the children to spend their time when they're not in school. Remember, school wasn't free at this time, so most of these children didn't get to go to school. This is also at the same time that they're working towards bringing free education so the kids could go. At first it wasn't compulsory, so they couldn't send their children to school. Why? Because they needed them to work so that they could have enough money to put food on the table. And so it wasn't until schools became compulsory that the kids then couldn't work in the factories and the parents then had to send them to school. So I want to share with you some of his photography. This one is called Mulberry Street, and you can see it's an alleyway between two apartments. You see the laundry hung up. Nothing wrong with hanging up your laundry, but just the crowdedness, the trash along the sides. This one is a Bayard Street tenement. This is just one of the rooms. Remember, I said most of them have 3 rooms. And you can see, if you count carefully, there's 2 men up on this upper bunk. You can see 2 men on that lower bunk. There's 2 sitting here, and you can see the feet of this one that's not in the image. You can see their belongings are just kind of hanging because there's no other place to put it. They're one of the lucky ones. They do have a freestanding wood-burning stove. They could heat their meals on. They could use it for heat. New York gets cold. But you can see literally there's hardly any floor space at all after they've stretched out to sleep. This was not uncommon. This is a cigar maker. This is 1880. This is also Jacob Reese photograph. All of these that I'm going to show you are. I think there's one in here I put in just to make a point. So this photograph, you see the children are not at school. They're there helping their father. Cigar rolling was a common in-home task you can do. The materials would be dropped off, and then the finished cigars would be picked up. And so this child is actually helping. This one's just hanging out, probably too old to know how to roll a cigar. This is Lower East Side, which is where he did most of his work. This is a family, and again, in a single room. You can see how dark this one is, even with the flash photography. And it also gives you an idea of the size. So there's a small table here where the mom and dad are sitting, and then this child is on a bedroll, and this is the corner of the room right behind this child. And so that's the width of the room. And this is one of, like I said, 3 rooms in a house that they probably rent just one. And if it's just that family living there, that's actually pretty good. This is the outside of the apartments. Because there was a housing shortage, because people were immigrating to America in such great numbers, you see these shanty towns, or in this case just on the outside of the buildings, pop up as well. Even blocking windows and things of the other buildings. Roofs that were probably not water safe, pretty poor conditions of living conditions. And this is, the industrial era. We're living the grand life in America at this time, based on the work of these people that are being forced to live like this. And Jacob Riis wanted people to see that. If that one doesn't tug at your heartstrings, I don't know what will. One of the problems during this time period was that women would die during its childbirth, not uncommon, or die of other issues, and children would be left homeless. Sometimes the father would just maybe not be able to find work and wander off looking for work and leaving his kids in the hands of the older one, and then they'd lose their apartment. There were so many children on the streets of New York that it became a problem, and they called them street rats. And they talked about how they were going to exterminate, not kill them, but how to deal with this vast number of children that were homeless on the streets. Orphanages could only, do so much. And there were a lot. The Catholic Church ran quite a few orphanages, trying to give them a home and meals. But even those became overcrowded, and they couldn't provide maybe the standard of living that you think children would deserve. They did also try to ship some of them off to families that wanted them on the Midwest and on the West Coast, because no one in New York wanted them. They thought of them all as street rats. Here's another example. This is a child holding what presumably is a sibling. When that child should be out playing herself or in school, instead she is left to care for a younger sibling, because it takes both parents to work to make enough money to just support yourself, just for the bare necessities. The children, as I mentioned, worked because it takes the whole family to work to bring enough money. And this is a child working in a glass factory. I never worked in a glass factory, so I don't know this firsthand, but I'm going to say it was probably hot and uncomfortable and dangerous. This is an elderly woman. She's doing handiwork in a small New York apartment. Now this one, you can really see the width of this apartment, how small it is. But she has, some luxury items there. She has a lamp, she's got a mirror, and she's filling her days doing, sewing and things to help support her family that way. Here's another typical tenement apartment. I see a family with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children, and an exhausted mom and dad. In any circumstances, you would be an exhausted mom and dad. But this is not a normal, I'm going to go to work at 8 and come home at 5. These hours were long and hard, and often 6 days a week. And there are times that you were told, well, we need extra work, so you have to work. You like work extra. Sometimes you didn't get paid extra for those hours. So I remember if you haven't read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, it takes place during the same time period, but it's in Chicago instead of New York. It's a must read. I wanted to say it's a good read. It's a book that'll make you upset, but it is a good read. And he wrote it for the same reason that Jacob Riis took these photographs, to expose the truth to people about what's going on. And in his book, he talked about how the men that worked in the stockyards had to show up at 7 in the morning, but if the train didn't show up till 2 or 3 in the afternoon, that's when they started their pay. All that rest of the time that they had to wait wasn't being paid because there was no work yet. And so things like that were very common. Women that worked in the factories making clothing sometimes had to provide their own materials, carry their own sewing machine in. And then if they wasted thread, like they had to take out some stitches, they were charged extra for that wasted thread. So not easy work and long, hard hours. Cotton mill operators. This is a photograph I use in my, many of these, but this one in particular in my class when I talk about the textile industry and using child labor, because you can pay a child less You can pay children less too, even if they're doing the same amount of work than as a man, because it's presumed that a woman doesn't need to get paid as much as a man, because a man's supporting him. And so the laws were very clear that you had to pay men more. And this child, not only is he getting paid very little, look at his feet. I'm sorry, but I think if OSHA had anything to say about it, they would think this child needs to have good shoes on his feet, not standing on equipment barefooted. So very dangerous work.
Dangerous.
Very dangerous work, yes. Without what we would consider a very important safety equipment. You can come on in if you like. Okay. This is a picture of a mom holding her infant, and I love this photograph because it shows how different the styles are. I love the way she has this baby just really wrapped up. It reminds me of the way the Russians used to wrap their babies, but this is an Italian woman. She looks exhausted, but the baby looks, you know, at peace right now at least. And you can see a bed folded up in front of her. That's probably how they got by, is push the beds to the side during the day and then laid them all out during the day. Laid them out at night. Mm-hmm. This is a man in his tenement living quarters. Again, the flash brightens the photograph so you can see how dirty it is. He's got a bucket here that if you ask me, that looks like it has coals in it, or ash. I think he's using that to warm the place. Doesn't seem safe to me. I hope he cracks a window. Windows are probably all cracked anyways. He has his trunk here, so this tells me this is a new immigrant, that his main piece of furniture is the trunk that he brought over on the steamship. And then his belongings are hanging because there's no other place to put them, including his shoes.
Shanty.
Pardon me?
Shanty.
Yes.
It looks like a shanty.
Yeah, it sure does. So, and the shape of the roof tells me he's at one of the top level tenements, or one of those lean-tos that are on the outside,
right.
rather than one of the ones that has a standard ceiling.
Yeah.
Oh, and so that brings us to Dorothea Lang, who is our second person I want to talk about. And I haven't been watching the time, but I might go a little over, and I apologize for that. Dorothea Lang lived much later than Jacob Reese, but they used their camera for the same thing, to show people what's going on. And, you know, when you got a tool, use it, right? And that's what they both felt like. This is something that I can do. So she lived from 1895 to 1965. She was born in New Jersey, but went to school in New York. She, at age 7, had polio, not uncommon during that time. And it left her right leg withered, and her foot kind of constantly curled up. And so when she walked, her heel didn't touch the ground. So as I said, she went to school in New York because her mother had a job at the library in New York. So she would go to New York with her mom and then go off to school. And she was supposed to come back to the library to do her homework. But she found it more interesting to wander the streets in New York. And so that's what she spent her childhood doing, walking around the streets of New York. And she was fascinated with photography. And so out of high school, she found a job at a local portrait studio and helped out there. And then she and a girlfriend decided to travel the world. And this is in 1918. So for two women to go off traveling the world in 1918 is showing something. They had gumption. You know, right out of high school, they should have been thinking about getting married and settling down in a home. But they're all, no, we've saved some money, because her friend had a job at one of the telephone stations where they plugged the lines in. What are those called? Telephone operator. And so they had saved their money, and they head out west, and then they're going to catch a ship and sail around the world. And they're in San Francisco at a diner when her friend, who had all the money with her, reached in to pay for their meal and realized that the pouch that was holding the money had been stolen. And so that's the end of their trip. So the girlfriend finds a job at the local phone operator, and Dorothea Lang takes off to a portrait studio and finds a job, and they end up making their home in San Francisco, and doing basically what they were doing in New York, because their trip was cut short. While Dorothea worked at this photo studio and Photoshop, it was kind of a combination, people that would come and talk to her to buy products and stuff were impressed with her knowledge. And so a group of artists actually loaned her money so she could start her own portrait studio. And she did. She opened a studio in San Francisco, and it became a favorite meeting place for the art society. The community of artists would stop. She had a couch and a record player and a bar, and in the evenings people would just kind of show up. And while she was there, she met what will be her future husband, a man by the name of Maynard Dixon. He was 21 years older than she was, but he fascinated her, and likewise. Maynard Dixon, if you're not familiar with him, is a famous artist of the Southwest. So he did a lot of Western art, a lot of desert landscapes and such. So he had a daughter from a previous marriage that came with him to his new marriage when he married Dorothea, because the mother, he said, wasn't fit, that she had spells. I don't really know what that means. And so as soon as they got married, he would take very long trips out to the Southwest. I'm going to go for a couple weeks and do some painting. He'd come back 6 months later, leaving her the whole while to raise this 15-year-old that had an attitude problem because she's being bounced from mom to dad to now stepmom, and dad's taking off. She ended up having 2 sons with Maynard. And on occasion, they would all go with him. But most of the time, she stayed home to work in her portrait studio to raise money so she could support her husband, who wanted to go off and do these wonderful paintings that weren't worth very much, except for if you had one now, it would be. So check all your art and see if you have any. And so their relationship became very tumultuous. She ended up closing down her studio because nobody could afford during the Depression to have their family sit for a portrait. And so with nobody coming to her studio, she decided to do something new. She took her camera outside and just started taking snapshots. Got to be careful how I say that. Snapshots of what was going on around her. And this is when she kind of discovers her true talent, is that seeing, and she always said that she wanted to teach her children how to see the world. It's not just looking at what's around you, but really seeing it. And so that's what she used her camera for, to show people really what's there. And so her and Dixon's relationship ended up ending in 1935. She remarried a man named Paul Taylor, 1935. Didn't waste a lot of time there. And she traveled with him to rural areas, and in the Southwest. He was an economics professor from Berkeley. And so she moved to Berkeley with him and brought her sons. And when she started traveling extensively with him, they put the kids in a boarding school. And at one point, they even had to foster them out. And she, all of her life, she had regretted doing that she put her photography above the children. And so it's during this time that she is most commonly known as the work she does during the Depression, photographing what migrant workers did. She worked with the, I'm looking for it on my notes. I didn't write it down. She worked for the, one of the New Deal organizations, a Farmers Association, and which became the Works Progress Farm Association. It did change its name later on. And so This was the first photograph she took when she left her studio. This is a bread line in San Francisco, and this photograph has been looked at and appreciated by many people. It's that image of that one man that's got his back to the line, he's leaning on the railing, he's got his bent up cup, and he's like giving up. You know, this is a symbol of the Depression right here, and all these men have no jobs, and they're just trying to get some bread to take home to their families. This is in San Francisco as well. Again, this is part of those early photographs that she took when she left her studio. But this is a photograph she's most known for, and I'm sure everyone here has seen this photograph. Yeah, it's called Migrant Mother. So Dorothea Lang, I call her Dorothy, just like she's my friend. No. She was out driving around, and it was kind of beginning to mist, and she was in the Central Valley, and she drove by and saw a sign that said Pea Pickers Camp. And she drove by it because she was tired and wanted her day to be over and wanted to get back. They usually set up at a local motel or something. And as she drove by it, she thought, something's calling me back to that camp. So she made a U-turn and went back. And when she got there, she met this woman. She's a 35-year-old mother of 7. She had showed up to this pea picking farm to work. But the farm owners had said that there had been a deep freeze the day before, and so the crop had frozen, so there was no crop left to pick. So she was just hanging out at this camp, and this is kind of how it worked. You would show up at a place that's advertising that the crop is ready, and you would work until the crop was completely picked, and then you'd hear about another one. You'd pack up your tent and your family, and you'd go to the next camp. And it used to be that you might work several weeks at, picking peas or strawberries or whatever it was. But so many people had come to California because of the Dust Bowl that what job might have lasted a couple weeks, there's so many people now that show up for that job that the crops are all picked and brought in by noon on the first day. And so now you're like, okay, now I got to go somewhere else. I've got to go find another place so that I can feed my family. And so all you're doing is basically earning enough money for a little bit of probably poor quality food for your family and trying to get to the next place. So interesting that we're seeing something very similar in this era that Dorothea Lang's taking pictures of, that Jacob Reese saw. People that are working their fingers to the bone, substandard living, and just can't get ahead, no matter what they do. So when Dorothea Lang came here, she met this woman, and Dorothea Lang's, instead of flashing a light in their face, what she says her success was because she got to know the people first. She would talk to them. And then when people got comfortable with her, she'd say, oh, can I take your picture? And she ended up taking a series of photographs. This is the one that got famous, but she started kind of far away and then kept moving closer. And so this is one of the first ones. This is that same woman. And these are some of her children wrapped around her in her little lean-to that's probably draped over her vehicle on the other side. That was a common way your tent was attached to your car. I don't know 100% sure that that's true. In this case, it could just be a normal tent. But then this is another one of those photographs. The same woman, she's just getting in a little closer. A little bit closer. And then the one, that was a money shot. And I say money shot, but it wasn't really. This woman was never compensated for this photograph, because remember, Dorothea Lang didn't say, I'll pay you to let me take your picture. And the Farm Bureau Association, I got the name, I knew it would come to me soon. The Farm Bureau Association was paying Dorothea to photograph. She didn't own the photographs. It belonged to them. And so years later, this woman said, I was never compensated for that. I didn't get credit for that. It was called Migrant Mother. It wasn't, my name was not even in that. In fact, I don't know this woman's name. And in this shot, so Dorothy, remember, she was a portrait artist at first. I use the name artist. She didn't like to be called an artist. She didn't consider herself an artist. She was a photographer. It is said that she actually asked the children to turn their heads away. That is helped with the composition of this photograph. But the anguish in that woman's face isn't fake. Even if she did help kind of pose it. She was taking a picture of what was really there, the infant in her arms and such. So this is Imperial Valley. Now she's gone out, that's towards Riverside, and taking pictures. This is a shanty, a Hooverville. The Depression got to the point where people were building houses out of whatever they could find, and this is an example of that. This one is called Broke, Baby Sick, and Car Trouble. And so this is probably a family that is just trying to get here probably from the Dust Bowl, and they would often have to stop, get some kind of work to get enough money to put gas in the tank, fix the car, and move to the next town until they actually got here. And so I don't know if you can see, there's a woman in a, what do you call those rounded hats, sitting here in front of the car with the baby on a blanket and their belongings on the back of that car. This is Oklahoma. So she did go into the Dust Bowl area to get some photographs. This is an overnight roadside camp. A lot of times they camped in groups because sometimes there's safety in numbers. And so they would kind of find themselves with the same group over and over. And so this is a large group camped together. This is near Exeter. That's in the Central Valley, agricultural area. Today it's citrus. I'm not sure what it was at this time. Porterville, which is right next to Exeter. This is near Marysville, and I believe that's up above Sacramento. And this is another one of those Hoovervilles. They called them Hoovervilles because they blamed the president because he said, just wait, this is all going to sort itself out. I don't really need to do anything. And so this is the results. Okay, so that's the pictures most people are familiar with. What most people don't know is that she was also employed during World War II. And her work during World War II is actually what brought me to study Dorothea Lang, because I was studying the Japanese internment. And I noticed, well, Dorothea Lang took that picture, and I was familiar with her only with the Migrant Mother one. And so I started digging up as much information as I could about Dorothea Lang because of her World War II pictures. And she worked for the government, taking pictures of the Japanese internment situation. Is everyone familiar with that, or should I do a quick review?
I've read about it.
So they believe, no.
In Manzanar.
They accused the Japanese for being enemies after Pearl Harbor, and so they passed a law that all Japanese Americans, whether they were born here or not, were going to be rounded up and put in internment camps on the other side of the mountain so that they couldn't get close enough to the ocean to send messages to Japan. And Manzanar is the closest one here. If you've never been to Manzanar, if you ever get a chance, if you're on that side of the mountains, it's turned into a historical landmark, and they have a museum and a road tour, and one of the bunk houses remade. A very powerful place to go, emotionally.
And Tule Lake.
There's one in Tule Lake. Yeah, there's like, I think 7 of them up and down from Oregon all the way through into California. She didn't agree with the internment. And her job was to take pictures that made it, prove to it that we were treating the Japanese fine and that everything was honky-dory. And Dorothea Lang's gonna do what she thinks is right. She's not gonna follow those instructions. Let's just put it that way. So her photographs were confiscated, and not until recently have they been published, because she would take pictures that showed things that the government didn't want the public to know was happening. And so some of those are in this slide. Some of them, like this one, it was not one of the ones that's confiscated. It just shows cute little Japanese children waiting. And so what they did is they took them to a temporary location while they waited to build the permanent internment camps. And so some of these photographs are them getting ready to go from wherever they are living. And you'll notice the kids are tagged. And I guess on one hand you think good so that they don't separate from their family. On the other hand, it reminds me of being tagged like a suitcase. And it just seeing someone tagged like that, it just doesn't feel right. A child crying from the window. This is in San Bruno. You can see the temporary building set up here. This is just a holding place while they're waiting. San Bruno's not far enough from the ocean. This is a line for lunch. And they didn't feed them the types of food that the Japanese were used to eating. This meal, or at least another one that I read about that was similar to this photograph, was boiled hot dogs, canned hot dogs, and canned spinach. I mean, I know we eat differently than we did back then, but I think under no circumstances does that sound like a good meal. This is Stockton, the assembly area there. It is a racetrack. So you can see this is a horse racetrack, and they put the homes in the middle. San Bruno used the horse stalls themselves. And each family, there was like 15 people per horse stall or per groom. And that again was where they held them while they were waiting. Now, most of these Japanese people had businesses in town, children were attending schools. These were not, non-contributing members of society. They lost homes that they owned. They lost their businesses to go and live in a horse stall. And this is Manzanar. As I said, this is the closest one to us, and is now a historical landmark. Common to have this type of scene. This is a dust storm. It's out in the desert. It's kind of it's on the 395 between Lone Pine and Independence. And those are two little towns that you've probably never heard of because they're so little. And so it was really out in the middle of nowhere. You know where Lone Pine is?
Mm-hmm. Well, we just watched a movie about someone who built a house in Lone Pine.
Okay.
Euler.
All right.
And it was interesting, but it is like that. It's just.
Yeah, and the mountains behind are actually quite beautiful. It's the other side of the Sierra Nevadas.
It's
dry
and
very dry, very dry. And so there's, at the peak, there was 1,000 something people that lived in Manzanar. Mealtime. This is one of the ones that was camouflaged. So they basically arrested them and put them in prison of war camps. Oh, I'm sorry, internment camps. And then they hired them, had them working to make camouflage for the war effort. And you're not allowed to have your prisoners of war work towards the war effort. But they're making camouflage. That's just a great picture of grandson and grandfather. This is the cemetery. This is a modern photograph, so this one's not Dorothea Lang's. This photograph is the cemetery, and there was about 135 deaths during the internment period here at Manzanar. Oh, and I thought I had one. There was a picture that I guess I didn't get. A lot of the residents at Manzanar built their own gardens and tended their own gardens to provide fresh fruits and vegetables. But they did eat, their main meals were all in a mess-like setting. And there was multiple mess that you were assigned to. And you did live in each of those bunkers that I showed you. that would be enough for 2 families, and the families often used blankets or sheets or something to divide them, so for some privacy between the families. And there was a small potbelly type stove for heat that they could cook on. And then they ended up having schools. They found teachers in there, and so they did try to recreate a community. The children formed sports teams, and for the teenagers, they had sock hops in the meeting room, and so they tried to do the best they could. A lot of the young men, if they agreed to fight for the United States, were allowed to leave, and they are some of the most recognized and honored men of the war were those groups that left the prison of war camps, or internment camps. So I told you that Dorothea Lang did not consider herself an artist. She considered herself a photographic documentarian, or a journalist, not really a artist. And her friends, your art. No, it's not art. I'm documenting what I see. And towards the end of her life in 1964, the Museum of Modern Art wanted to display her work. And it took several years to gather the photographs together and to make this display. And fortunately, she actually died before the display was open. But it was quite an honor to her work to be recognized, and not just as social reform, which is what its purpose was, but also recognized for her artwork. So this leads us to the questions part of the presentation.